Hey everyone, Joey here, aka Animus, and it's just gonna be a quick one today because on top of this being like one of the greatest New Music Fridays I've ever seen, there is some news today that I want to talk about, and that is that next January, after nearly 4.5 years, the legendary boundary-pushing techno duo Orbital are finally going to be releasing their new album titled Optical Delusion. Plus, have given us a small taste of the album already. Now, if you're a more long-term viewer of the channel, you'll probably know a bit about my history of Orbital. They are a strong contender for my favourite band of all time. If I just think about the longevity of my fascination with their particular symphonic brand of electronic music, they put out a string of like 4 masterpieces in a row in the 1990s, which have become some of my most listened to albums of all time. I religiously collect their music to the point where I've dedicated an entire cube of this shelf to Orbital stuff, and I even had the surreal pleasure of meeting them a couple of months ago, which I still cannot quite believe. Now, their last album, 2018's Monsters Exist, that was so cringy, was one that seemed to elicit a somewhat polarized reaction from fans. It was a more dark and ominous take on some of the sounds they'd previously explored, predominantly instrumental with an interesting mix of the new and old. Personally, I thought this album was great, and I still distinctly remember the day, all the way back in September of 2018, going into HMV after school to buy this thing and being hyped out of my mind. The thought that that was 4 whole years ago is incredibly strange, and as someone who's like only in relatively recent years become a music enthusiast, this kind of wait of several years between albums for a band I love is not something I experience very often. Since then, we've seen a spin-off here and there, and a decent collection of 30th anniversary alternate versions containing 2 solid new tracks. But Optical Delusion will be their first album of full new material since Monsters Exist. Not as big a gap as the one between Wonky and that album where they broke up and got back together again, which we can pray does not happen again, but still a pretty hefty chunk of time to develop new work. So yes, the full track listing for Optical Delusion has been revealed. The name and artwork seem to both be a continuation of the political overtones and grotesque imagery of their last album, which is nice. But looking at the tracks on this album, I must say I do have a few reservations and doubts. For one thing, there are only 2 tracks here which don't have a featured artist on them, one of which bizarrely directly shares a title with the most recent Strokes album. Whether they realised this or not, I do not know. But also, the featured artists in question, I've only heard of 2 of them, being Sleaford Mods and Anna B. Savage, and some of the others I can't really even find much information about on the internet. The 2 that most intrigue me, though, are the Medieval Babes, and Koppei, who appears to be a veteran of Japanese electronic music, which is interesting. So because of the ambiguity of some of these artists when I look them up, we don't know exactly what all of them will be contributing, but it seems to mostly be vocal additions likely, which leads me to believe that this will be a mostly vocal-led and fairly poppy Orbital album, which is not really what I was looking for in new material from them. This is not to say that there isn't a good host of really good vocal-led Orbital tracks. About half of Paul Hartnell's fairly recent 858 side project contained featured vocalists, and that album in my opinion was great. But then there's Paul's little side project with poet Murray Lachlan Young, The Virus Diaries, which was not meant to be taken seriously at all, but some of its production styles did seem to carry on forward into the 2 new tracks on their 30-something compilation, and this new single, which I will get to later of course, with some sound palettes that could come across as a little cheap or not living up to the richness that Orbital are capable of. Length never directly denotes quality, but Orbital have this special way of putting together these great symphonic pieces of music that go on for 9, 10, 15 minutes, which are kind of one of the biggest things which really sets them apart as one of my all-time favorites. But these guys actually haven't breached the 9-minute mark since 2001's The Altogether, and Monsters Exist, for all its grandeur, really left me kind of wanting to see if next they could come up with another epic in that kind of vein. The signs do point to these new tracks being more vocal-led and succinct experiences, so my hope for a modern Out There Somewhere or Are We Here is kind of faint. I doubt What a Surprise or Ring a Ringer, the old pandemic folk song, are going to be out-of-body experiences, but obviously they could end up just executing it really damn well, so probably the best indicator of this album's quality is this new single, Dirty Rat featuring Sleaford Mods, and I'm happy to say I like it. It follows a pretty typical verse-chorus song structure, but it is at the same time a hard-as-shit techno banger. Not the most subtle or melodic thing at all. Its sound is pretty much straight out of, like, 1992 or something, but with a sort of modern sheen over it. I'm only vaguely familiar with Sleaford Mods. I've heard a couple of their tracks and caught a bit of their set at Forwards Festival. Their lead singer delivers politically charged spoken word passages here in a very thick, obviously British accent. There's always been a strong political side to Orbital's music, and luckily, despite being older than my parents, sorry to point that out, they are very much on the left, as very clearly evidenced when I met them in person. It seems to be just a pretty unambiguous dig at Tories, which is unbelievably apt given they happened to release this track on the exact day that Liz Truss resigned, which they could not have seen coming but was pretty perfect. And the way this track builds and gets more heavy and dense over time is very fun to listen to, and I'm glad to hear everyone involved clearly having fun. So if every track on this album was in a similar vein and executed as well, yes, I would enjoy it, but as I said, I'm hoping for them to play to their unbelievable strengths with instrumental passages, and to see a fairly varied listen, with some things new and some things old, just like their last album. So, overall, whatever they do, I will be very excited to give it a listen, but my fingers are strongly crossed that Orbital can live up to their full potential on this next release. I'd love to hear, though, what any other Orbital fans and my followers have to say, and I have no idea how my comments in this video are going to age, but for now, thank you for watching. See you next time.